Spoofing attacks are a technique in which an attacker impersonates another user or device on the network. It's easily depicted by using IP addresses. In this example, we have host A, host B, and host C. Host A and host B are having a conversation, and A's address is 10.1.1.1. B's address is 10.1.1.2, and C starts talking to B and says his address is 10.1.1.1. All of a sudden, C is now spoofing A to inject himself into the conversation. This is an example of a spoofing attack. We are fooling or pretending to be someone that we are not. Now, that's just one type of spoofing, IP spoofing. ARP is another method, DNS is another method, and email is another method of spoofing that we commonly see in our networks today. ARP spoofing, well, when we think about it, ARP is the idea, address resolution protocol, of translating IP addresses into MAC addresses so that we can create the layer 2 header and send traffic out on the physical network. If we don't have ARP resolution, we can't create an Ethernet frame. Well, what is the reason for spoofing ARP entries or spoofing somebody's MAC address on the network? Well, most likely to intercept data. We saw this in our ARP cache poisoning example. Essentially what happens is an attacker sends out a message, a gratuitous ARP, and says, I am the gateway. He is spoofing the IP address of the gateway and providing a new MAC address. The hope is that the gateway and the host that are communicating will send their traffic through the attacker device. So the host updates his ARP cache and now forwards traffic to the attacker, who forwards traffic then onto the default gateway to avoid visibility and detection. He can also, as an attacker, spoof or send out gratuitous ARP for the host so that the gateway returns traffic to him. Creates a man-in-the-middle attack, of course, but at the same time it is an example of ARP spoofing. This attacker can run that from his machine locally on the network there, or a compromised host, and he can do it remotely, so it's kind of nasty. Now, mitigating these attacks, well, you got tools like Snort and ARPWatch that are going to help me identify this behavior as it happens on the network, and intrusion prevention systems like our new Cisco Firepower devices that are running Snort are going to be able to identify some of this for us. But we can also use dynamic ARP inspection, and that'll help us to mitigate some of these ARP spoofing attacks. Returning to the example of IP spoofing, we saw how an attacker can inject himself into a conversation where we had A and B having that conversation, and C decided to come into the picture and spoof an address. That's just one example. Another example is using IP spoofing as a method of launching a denial of service attack. So here's how that could potentially happen. Alright, let's just assume that we have a gateway router and it's connected to our local area network at 10.1.1.0. On the outside of that gateway router, we have the internet. As you can see in this example, the internet has an attacker sitting out there, and the attacker is sending traffic in. We have a server that's on the 10.1.1 network. It's an address of 10.1.1.100, and that attack is coming in with a source IP address of 10.1.1.50. Okay, so our gateway router here is not doing any checks to see if that source address should be allowed. And the packet comes in, and remember we said this was going to be a denial of service attack. So the server gets this request. It's from 10.1.1.50, and it's a TCP SYN message. Well, I'm on the 10.1.1 network, so when I reply, I'm going to send an ARP for him. And maybe he actually responds. Maybe there really is a 10.1.1.50 address sitting out here. But let's say he responds and I get ARP resolution, so I know who he is, but then I send the TCP, the SYN ACK, and this guy is like, what are you talking about? I don't know what's going on here. Well, now we've got this whole issue of this internal server is having sessions that keep getting set up and reset. This server would send a TCP RST back, a reset, and say, hey, reset that connection. I didn't try to open it. And if this keeps happening over and over and over again, Well, now you've got some problems, right? That server is sitting here servicing all of these requests and these reset messages for no reason. The other alternative is that the source IP address that is spoofed comes off of a bogon list and it's not in use on the internet, or it's one of the other addresses like 192.168.1.x, and as that packet comes in, we don't check. We try to reply back to it. Nobody ever replies because it was a spoofed address, and then I consume all of my resources. So again, another example of how this can be used as a denial of service attack by simply spoofing the source IP address or pretending to be someone that we're not. How do we mitigate against this? Well, simple. We put an access control list on our outside interface, and we tell it, don't allow traffic to come in if it's sourced from any of the private RFC 1918 addresses or any of the bogons that are known, and a list of other addresses that are known to be unused addresses, the ones that are used for documentation and things along those lines, reserved address space, 127.0.0, and so on. That'll help us to mitigate against IP spoofing on the network. Okay, another method of spoofing is DNS spoofing. This is where the attacker is going to change the host name to IP mapping by compromising a DNS server. This attack spoofs responses from the DNS server. After successful sniffing the packet capture, the attacker can guess the sequence numbers. This does require additional attacks, like a man-in-the-middle attack, but once the DNS server is spoofed, then that attacker can send false replies pretending to be a server, spoofing the server, send back replies that are pointing us to the wrong websites. Now we can mitigate this by using something known as DNS security, adding digital certificates and security certificates as well. And again, strong access control inbound on our network to make sure that we're not changing or that we're not allowing any addresses to be sourced from the outside that we should not see. And finally, another attack vector or another spoofing method is email spoofing. And so I remember launching an attack like this a long time ago. I actually did it to my kid brother. What I did is we were working together and I fired up a Linux laptop, and in Linux I opened up an application known as Pine, P-I-N-E. It was a very simple email application that would let me send email messages from any address that I entered into the application. So I sent my brother an email and told him that he could go home for the day. But I didn't send it to him from my account. I spoofed the email address of my manager. Now my manager was in on this. Everybody knew what was going on, and we laughed and joked about it. It was kind of funny. But again, you can see the danger. Now, most of the time, email spoofing isn't going to come from a user who's opening Pine on a network and sending out email messages. That's not generally how they're going to craft this type of an email spoofing attack. But usually what happens is there are SMTP servers that lack authentication features, and because of that, they will be compromised, emails will be relayed through them, and can spoof anybody else's email address. You may have seen this yourself. Sometimes you look at your junk mail folder and you got a bunch of emails that look like they came from you. And upon further investigation, you find out that even though it has your email address in the from portion, it does not track back to you. It's because someone's spoofing your email. Now, how do we protect against this? Well, spam filtering, of course. We want to watch our email headers to see where the message actually came from. And obviously, we want to watch for malware that can be delivered in email spoofing attacks. So we don't want to click on links or attachments that we are not expecting. And then finally, encrypt your messages and digitally sign your messages. And if you do this, then you're adding just another layer of security that will help to prevent against email spoofing. These are just a couple examples of different spoofing type of attacks, a very real attack that we have to contend with. Comes in many forms, but again, as a cybersecurity analyst, we're going to be well aware of each of these.